She wasn't their biological mother. She was a stranger, but she gave them everything she had. And then, 25 years later, as she stood alone facing the law, one of those 3 boys appeared. He stood before the court and uttered a single sentence no one saw coming, a sentence that proved the love she had given had forged the strongest shield to protect her. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's begin the story of Evelyn's home. In a forgotten, fading corner of a small town in Alabama, on Elm Street, stood a little white house, its paint weathered by time. The paint was peeling, the porch groaned under any weight, but for 3 little boys cast aside by life itself, it was the only home they had ever known. And inside lived Evelyn Carter, a 4-5-year-old black widow. Evelyn had lost her husband to cancer. They'd had no children, and their meager savings had been buried right along with him. She worked washing dishes at a local diner, a quiet, kind woman, the type to leave scraps on the back stoop for the stray cats. One raw, rainy October morning, she pushed open her screen door and froze. Huddled under a tattered blanket by the trash cans were 3 little white boys, barefoot, soaked to the bone, and shivering. "Oh, you boys," she whispered, her voice as soft as an old woolen blanket. "Lord have mercy, you're soaked clean through." Caleb, the oldest, instinctively pulled his 2 younger brothers closer, his gaze as wary as a cornered animal. Evelyn didn't ask who they were or where they came from. She just looked into their sunken eyes and smudged faces and asked a single, gentle question. "When was the last time you boys had a proper, hot meal?" Their silence was all the answer she needed. She let out a long sigh, one heavy with both heartache and resolve. "All right then, get on inside. Come on now, before you all catch your death of cold." She swung the door wide open, and just like that, the house on Elm Street was no longer quiet. Caleb was the oldest at 11, with a fierce protective instinct, a chipped tooth, and fists that were already used to taking and giving blows. Drew, about 9, was the quiet one. His eyes were always darting, always scanning, always afraid. And then there was Jaime, the 6-year-old baby of the family, who still sucked his thumb and wouldn't speak a single word for the first 3 months he lived with Evelyn. They were brothers, bound by blood and bruises. Their mother had left. As for their father, no one asked anymore. To the world, they were throwaway kids. But to Evelyn, from the second she opened that door, they were simply her boys. Life in the little house on Elm Street quickly settled into a new rhythm, one of both warmth and hardship. Her own bedroom, the only one that caught the morning sun, became theirs. Evelyn moved into the small storage room, saying only, "Growing boys need a proper bed." But the real challenge wasn't in the scant meals or the nightly mending of worn-out clothes. It lay in healing 3 deeply wounded souls. Each boy was a world unto himself, covered in scars she had to learn to tend to with the lightest of touches. Some days, she'd barely walk in the door from her exhausting shift at the diner when the phone would ring. It was the principal, Caleb again. He'd given another kid a bloody nose. That night, as Evelyn gently tended to his bruised knuckles, Caleb mumbled, his eyes fixed on the floor. "He called you a bad name, said you weren't my real mom." Evelyn paused, her heart clenching in her chest. She gently lifted his chin. "Oh, my sweet boy," she said, her voice firm but full of love. "A part of me is so proud you stood up for me. But listen to me. Fighting only ever leads to more hurt. The strongest thing you have isn't in your fists, Caleb. It's in your head. It's in your words." She placed a hand over her own heart, then over Caleb's. "And don't you ever let anyone tell you I'm not your mother. Motherhood isn't about the color of our skin, baby. It's about what's in here." As Caleb's angry fists were slowly replaced by words, Drew's hands presented Evelyn with a different kind of worry. The boy was used to fending for himself, and the habit of petty theft still clung to him. One afternoon, while cleaning their room, she found a candy bar in the pocket of Drew's jacket. Instead of scolding him, she waited until that evening, when the house was quiet, and sat down beside him. "Drew, honey," she began, her voice completely void of judgment. "We don't have to do that anymore. You're safe in this house. If you need something, you come and you tell me. You just ask. If I have it, it's yours. If I don't, we'll figure it out together. Do you hear me? You're not alone anymore." But perhaps Evelyn's greatest lesson in patience came from Jaime, the youngest, who remained as silent as a shadow. He clung to her side constantly, but his world seemed to be without sound. Every night, after Caleb and Drew were asleep, Evelyn would sit by Jaime's bed and read him fairy tales. She expected nothing in return, simply letting her voice be a blanket around him. Then one night, after finishing a story, she closed the book and whispered, "Good night, my sweet Jaime." As she turned to leave, a tiny sound, like a falling leaf, came from behind her. More. Evelyn stopped, her whole body freezing in place. She turned back slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What did you say, baby?" Jaime looked at her, his eyes wide in the dim light. He repeated, a little clearer this time, "Read more." "Oh, dear Lord," Evelyn whispered, pressing a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. That night, Evelyn didn't cry from exhaustion or loneliness. She cried from pure joy, because that one small word more held the weight of a world reborn. The years passed like pages turning in a book in that little house on Elm Street. The skinny little boys were now tall young men, each with dreams of his own. The house was no longer filled with quiet storytelling, but with boisterous arguments, laughter, and the occasional blast of loud rock music. Evelyn smiled as she watched them grow, the scars of their pasts fading to make way for strength and confidence. And then, as it always does, the day came for the birds to leave the nest. Caleb was the first to leave. The boy with the angry fists had found his purpose in the discipline and honor of the military. He wanted to protect not just his brothers, but his country. The day he shipped out, Evelyn saw him off at the bus station. He didn't say much, just pulled her into a tight, silent hug, one that said everything words couldn't. "You take care of yourself, Mom," Caleb said, his voice now deeper, rougher. "You do the same," Evelyn managed, her voice thick with emotion as she patted his back. "You write to me now, you hear? Don't you go making me worry." She stood there long after the bus disappeared down the dusty road, watching the straight back of the young soldier. Her heart was a mix of pride and a familiar, gut-wrenching worry. The house felt impossibly empty that night. 2 years later, it was Drew's turn. The quiet, observant boy had found his passion in building things. He'd landed an apprenticeship as a carpenter in Chicago, a big city that promised a future brighter than their small town ever could. The night before he left, Drew sat with Evelyn on the porch swing. "I'll send money home as soon as I can," he said, his gaze steady. The boy whose hands once only knew how to take now wanted to use them to build, to give back. Evelyn shook her head, her eyes glistening in the porch light. "I don't need your money, Drew. All I need is for you to build a good life for yourself. Be a good man and be happy. That's the greatest gift you could ever give me." And then, it was just her and Jaime. The little boy who hadn't spoken a word was now a brilliant student, the pride of his teachers. It was a moment of pure, unbridled joy when Jamie received a full scholarship to a prestigious university. He was the first in their family to go to college. On his last night, with his bags all packed, Jaime sat with Evelyn in the kitchen, the heart of their home. He looked at the woman who had sacrificed her entire life for them, her hair now streaked with more silver. "Mom," Jaime began, his voice choked with emotion, "everything I have today, everything I am, it's all because of you." Evelyn smiled, a warm but bittersweet expression. She took his hand, her calloused palm covering the smooth hand of the young scholar. "Jaime," she said softly, "it's a big world out there. You're going to meet new people, learn amazing things, and you can become anyone you want to be. She paused, looking deep into his eyes. "But you promise me one thing. No matter where you go, what you do, or how great a man you become, you will always be my son. And this house," she glanced around the familiar kitchen, "will always be your home, always." The next morning, as Amy's silhouette vanished through the university gates, Evelyn returned to the house on Elm Street. She stepped into the silence. It wasn't a peaceful silence, but the hollow quiet of a great accomplishment, and the profound loneliness that was just beginning to set in. After her boys left, the house on Elm Street became terrifyingly still. The quiet was no longer a comfort, it was a gaping void. Evelyn started to hear the house's own sighs in the creaking floorboards, to see its fatigue in the peeling paint on the walls. It was as if she and the house were growing old together, settling into a shared loneliness. And it was in the midst of this quiet decay that a stranger came to her door. He was unlike anyone else in the neighborhood. Polished, well-spoken, with a disarmingly warm smile, he introduced himself as Mr. Sullivan, an architect from the Community Heritage Foundation. What caught Evelyn's attention wasn't the offer itself, but the way he spoke about her house. "A home that raised 3 such fine young men," he said, his eyes full of admiration, "deserves to be cherished, Mrs. Carter. Just imagine their faces when they come home and see this place made new again." That sentence struck a deep chord in Evelyn's heart. It was her secret fear that her boys would return to a dilapidated place, that she hadn't been able to give them a better home. Mr. Sullivan wasn't just promising to fix a house, he was promising to restore her pride. He wasn't pushy. Over the next few days, he returned to take measurements and listen to her stories about her boys. He turned a business proposition into a personal connection. Only when he had her complete trust did he gently bring up the formalities. To release the funds from the foundation, he explained with professional ease, "We require you to deposit your savings with us as a good faith trust. The money is fully refunded upon completion, of course, and will also need the original deed to the house to file the permits with the city." It all sounded so official, so reasonable. The hope of a beautiful home for her sons to return to had become a roaring fire, burning away any last embers of doubt. With her heart pounding with excitement for a brighter future, Evelyn went to her room, retrieved the old metal box, and handed him everything she had. As his polished car pulled away, Evelyn stood on the porch, clutching the receipt. She felt a sense of relief and joy she hadn't felt in years. She had no idea the storm was just beginning, and she had just handed over her only umbrella. Every morning, Evelyn woke with a sweet anticipation she hadn't known for a long time. She'd peer out the window at the sound of every passing car, her heart giving a little leap. But the days bled into one another in silence. The sweet anticipation slowly soured into a vague anxiety, which then curdled into a cold, sinking feeling when she finally tried the number on his business card. "The number you have dialed is not in service." That flat, robotic voice was the first real alarm bell, but she desperately clung to flimsy excuses. And then, the cruelest blow didn't come from a voice, but from a piece of paper. A thick, official-looking envelope with the bank's red seal was in her mailbox. As Evelyn's trembling hands tore it open, the words swam before her eyes. "Mortgage loan, payment past due, notice of foreclosure." And there, beneath the staggering amount of debt, was her own signature, stolen from a harmless temporary agreement form. The air was sucked from her lungs. He hadn't just taken her money. He had turned her home, her very soul, into a trap. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the shame. How could she call her boys? How could she tell them that their strong mother, the one who taught them to be smart and wary, had been naive enough to hand over everything? She couldn't. The shame was a lock on her throat, forcing her to face this nightmare alone. The courtroom was cold and impersonal. Everything was rigid and formal. From the hard wooden benches to the judge's impassive face, Evelyn felt small and lost, a silent lie clinging to her skin. On the other side, The bank's lawyer spoke with clinical precision, each of his words an undeniable fact. There was a contract, there was a signature, there was a debt. Her own lawyer, a tired, court-appointed man, could only offer a story that sounded wild and fantastical, a defense with no proof. Evelyn tried to speak, to explain about the man with the warm smile and the beautiful promises, but her voice faltered. In this room, her story sounded like a child's tale. She could see it in the judge's eyes, not sympathy, but impatience. Based on the evidence presented, his voice droned on, flat and decisive. This court sees no reason to deny the plaintiff's request. The judge's voice was a monotone, as merciless as the final swing of a hammer. Evelyn's world narrowed to a dull roar in her ears. She closed her eyes, bracing for the sharp crack of the gavel that would officially shatter not just her ownership of a house, but a lifetime of memories. Wait. A sharp voice cut through the room from the back. The heavy oak doors had swung open. Every head, including the judge's, turned with a frown toward the man who had just entered. He was a young man in a tailored suit, tall and poised, who walked with a confident, purposeful stride. His face was painfully familiar. Evelyn's eyes flew open, her heart skipping a beat before hammering against her ribs. That hair, those eyes. His gaze swept the courtroom and landed on her. He gave a slight, reassuring nod before turning to the judge. "Your Honor, my apologies for the interruption," he said, his voice clear, strong, and full of an authority Evelyn had never heard before. "I have new information and evidence that bears directly on this case." The bank's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Who is this man? These proceedings are all but concluded." The judge tapped his gavel lightly. "And who are you, son?" The young man strode forward, placing his leather briefcase on a table. He looked the judge square in the eye, then glanced at his mother, who was frozen in stunned, tearful silence. "My name is Jaime Carter, Your Honor. I am counsel for the defendant, my mother, Mrs. Evelyn Carter." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. The bank's lawyer's jaw dropped. The judge raised an eyebrow, the weariness on his face replaced by a flicker of astonishment and curiosity. Evelyn couldn't believe her ears. Jamie, her baby boy, a lawyer. Jaime didn't waste a second. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick file. "Your Honor," he continued, his voice now as cold as steel, "my mother told the truth. She is the victim of a professional con artist named Arthur Finch, who also goes by the alias Mr. Sullivan." He placed a photograph of Mr. Sullivan on the table. "Finch preys on the elderly, the trusting, and the lonely. He exploits their kindness to steal their assets, and my mother is not his only victim." Jamie flipped to another page in his file. "Over the past 2 months, I have identified 6 other victims of Arthur Finch in the state of Alabama alone. 6 people who lost their homes and their life savings to the exact same scheme. This file," he slid it toward the court clerk, "contains sworn affidavits from all 6 of them, along with bank records proving that the funds from these fraudulent loans were all funneled to a shell corporation set up by Finch." He looked directly at the bank's lawyer. "A minimum of due diligence would have flagged my mother's loan application as highly irregular. But the bank overlooked it, perhaps too eager for a lucrative mortgage." Finally, Jaime turned back to his mother. His voice softened, now filled with the love and conviction forged over years. "Your Honor, that man targeted my mother because he saw a kind, trusting, and lonely woman. He saw that as a weakness." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. The entire courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on the file now resting on the judge's bench. He turned the pages one by one, his expression growing more solemn with each one. He wasn't just reading facts and figures, he was reading a story of cruel deception and the quiet suffering of innocent people. The bank's lawyer tried to object, but his words were hollow and weightless against the mountain of undeniable proof Jaime had presented. Finally, the judge looked up, He wasn't looking at the papers anymore, he was looking directly at Evelyn, and in his eyes, she no longer saw judgment, but understanding. The foreclosure request is denied. Crack. The sharp, final sound of the gavel echoed through the room. It didn't just end a court case, it shattered the weight that had been crushing Evelyn for months. She sat frozen, barely daring to breathe. The house was hers. The simple thought resonated in her mind, more powerful than any legal verdict. Then, a ragged sob escaped her lips. Tears streamed down her face, not of sorrow this time, but of pure, unburdened relief. Jaime was by her side in an instant, kneeling and wrapping his arms around her trembling shoulders. "It's okay, Mom," he whispered, his own voice thick with emotion. "It's over. You're safe now." Evelyn looked up into the eyes of her youngest son. She saw more than a brilliant lawyer. She saw the 6-year-old boy she used to read to every night. That little boy had grown up and used his own voice to tell her story, to fight for her. She had gotten her house back, and she had gotten her son back, stronger and more resolute than she could have ever imagined. A few days after the trial, as a fragile peace began to settle back into the house on Elm Street, a familiar yet distant sound rumbled down the lane. It was the growl of an old pickup truck. Evelyn and Jaime looked out the window to see 2 tall figures climbing out. It was Caleb and Drew. They hadn't called. The moment they heard from Jaime, they had dropped everything, Caleb taking emergency leave, Drew closing up his workshop and driven through the night to come home. The reunion was a quiet one. Caleb, the stoic soldier, simply walked up and pulled his mother into his arms. His hug was strong, protective, as if trying to make up for all the months she had faced the storm alone. Drew stood back, his eyes scanning the peeling paint, the rickety porch, the gilt plane on his face. "We're sorry, Mom," Drew said, his voice raspy. "We should have been here." Evelyn shook her head, fresh tears welling up, this time from a place of pure joy. She reached out, pulling both of her older sons into her embrace. "You're here now," she said, her voice muffled against their chests. "You're here now. That's all that matters." And then, the real restoration began. Not by a con man with empty promises, but by the very hands this house had sheltered. Drew, with his carpenter's skill, became the foreman. He measured, he sawed, and he replaced the rotten planks of the front porch. The steady rhythm of Caleb's hammer echoed from the roof as he replaced every broken shingle. And Jaime, while a bit clumsy with a hammer and nails, was the most efficient runner, fetching supplies, mixing paint, and making sure everyone stayed hydrated. The house was once again filled with life. Laughter rang out when Jaime nearly tipped over a full can of paint. Old stories were retold over the whine of a power saw. They worked from sunup to sundown, their shirts soaked with sweat, but not a single complaint was uttered. Evelyn was busy in her kitchen again, cooking the boys' favorite meals, the aromas wafting through the house like a warm embrace. She wasn't just watching them fix a house, she was watching them heal a wound, rebuilding a home. Finally, on a Sunday afternoon, the work was mostly done. The fresh coat of white paint gleamed in the setting Sunday, the porch no longer groaned. The little house on Elm Street stood there, simple but strong, infused with a new vitality. Evelyn sat on the porch swing Drew had just repaired. Caleb sat on the steps to her right, Drew to her left, and Jaime leaned against the porch column right beside his mother. No one spoke. They just sat together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire. In that comfortable silence, they felt it all. They weren't just 3 white boys who had been taken in by a black woman. They were a family. Caleb, Drew, and Jaime looked at their mother, the small woman with a boundless heart who had given them everything. And Evelyn looked at the 3 strong, grown men beside her, and she knew. The love she had given had come full circle, returning to protect her when she needed it most. The con man had tried to steal a house, but he could never touch a home. because Evelyn's home wasn't built with wood and nails. It was built with a love that endures all.